This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, I'm flying solo, talking all about one of my guys, that's Marshall Rifai. Rifai entering his second season on an NHL contract with the Maple Leafs, entering his third season total in the organization. He signed an American Hockey League deal with the Marlies back in 2022 after finishing his career with Harvard, and parlayed that into a 2-year NHL contract last year. Fun fact, he actually didn't get an entry-level contract. It was a straight-up 2-year standard contract that he signed last year because of his age. He's already 26 years old. So even though he's only got 2 years pro under his belt, has only had one season on an NHL contract, he's actually already 26 years old. Rifai made his NHL debut last season playing against the St. Louis Blues and Arizona Coyotes in a pinch in the middle of the season, played just over 11:30 in his NHL debut against the Blues, and played a little bit more, 11:46 in his second game against the Coyotes before being returned to the Marlies. Of course, that was when the Leafs were in dire need of any defenseman, and I believe at the time he was the 11th defenseman used by the Leafs last season. So why is Marshall Rifai one of my guys? I think there's a player here. I don't know if he'll ever get an opportunity, or when he gets an opportunity, what he'll make of it, whether he'll be an NHL regular or just kind of a depth guy. But I think Rifai can hang at the NHL level. As many people in the Leafs organization have said, he's got legit NHL attributes. Sheldon Keefe, Ryan Hardy, Haley Wickenheiser, like all three of those people have played major roles in the Leafs organization. Obviously, Keefe has moved on, but Ryan Hardy's still GM of the Marlies. Haley Wickenheiser still runs the player development program, and all three of those people have lauded Rifai's skating ability, his defensive ability, and his physicality. Ryan Hardy said that he's a world-class skater. Keefe said straight up last year when he got called up, said that he's got NHL attributes to him and specified the skating, his closing speed, and the physicality. And same for Haley Wickenheiser over the past couple of years. So Rifai is one of those AHL guys that isn't going to put up numbers that are gaudy and make you go, this guy needs to be on an NHL roster. Over 2 seasons, 126 AHL games, he only has 6 goals and 35 points in the regular season. Now, that's funny to note because in the playoffs, Rifai actually scored a goal per game in the playoffs this year. He had 3 goals in 3 games for 4 total points in the Marlies' brief playoff run. But that's not the kind of player that he is. He's a defense first, basically defense only type player. And that shows up in some of the not really advanced stats because we don't really have those at the AHL level, but shows up in some of the underlying numbers if you dig a little bit deeper. He's a plus 17 over the 2 seasons. This past year, he was a plus 14, which is particularly notable in 57 games. And using AHL Tracker for some kind of extra data there between the goals for, goals against, things like that at even strength, particularly on the defensive side, that's where Rifai really stands out. Now, we do get a glimpse behind the curtain at some advanced stats thanks to Jacob Stoller on Twitter, where he put out one of the player cards for Rifai in March, I believe around when he was called up or right when he was called up, and showed that Rifai, among AHL defensemen, ranked in the 99th percentile in expected goals against per 60, and the 93rd percentile in shots against per 60. Shot attempts, I should say, Corsi against, whatever you want to call it. So extremely good defensive numbers. That's why he got the call up. He's a very good skater, world-class skater, as said by Ryan Hardy, can hang at the NHL level in terms of those attributes. So why hasn't he necessarily been an NHL option or regular to this point? I think part of that is just kind of opportunity. There was a lot of guys on the depth chart ahead of Rifai last year. After all, it was his first season on an NHL contract. There was a lot for him to still kind of grow as a player. You look at just some of the players that played over him last year, the Simone Benoits, the William Lagesson types. Like, there's a lot of guys that got some NHL run just being ahead of him on the depth chart, and it took until the 11th option for him to finally get a call. So part of that is the reason, and part of that's going to be the reason why it's going to be tough for him to get NHL minutes again this upcoming season. But I think if he gets a shot and gets some extended play, I think he could be a guy that hangs because of the elite skating, because of the physicality. This is a guy that over 2 seasons, 126 games at the AHL level, has 189 penalty minutes. He regularly throws the body, is not afraid to engage physically, will stand up for teammates in plenty of situations, and sometimes steps over the line doing so as well. There's a couple of instances that come to mind in that regard. For Rifai, part of the reason why he hasn't necessarily been an NHL regular is reining in some of that discipline and finding the time and place to be physical and to engage in certain ways like that. But he was glad to go and drop the gloves with somebody that is out of his weight class. He's done that a handful of times in his AHL career. It's not something that is going to look great on his highlight reel, to say the least, most of the time, but it is something that earns a lot of respect from teammates and from coaching staffs and from management. It's part of the reason why he got called up last year, is that kind of willingness to engage physically in addition to the physical traits in terms of his skating and defensive acumen in terms of his stick play. For Rifai, the big area that's the big question mark is the offensive side. Never going to be a very good offensive player. 16 points in his rookie season in 69 games, 19 points last year. It's just not a thing for him in the offensive zone. It would have been nice to see that develop more just given his skating ability. You would think that there would be more rushing ability, kind of in zone cycle play. It's just not really developed for Rifai, and at 26 years old, it's just not really going to happen at this point. I was hoping to see more puck confidence for Rifai, carrying the puck, being more of a threat, kind of pushing play up the ice on the rush. Maybe that could come with better line mates, but ultimately, again, at 26 years old, it's just probably not going to come at this point. So for Rifai, with the lack of the offensive side, he's a relatively average sized, actually I'll get to that in a second, average sized defenseman with elite skating, good defensive acumen, strong physicality, willingness to engage. Kind of how far can that take you? And I think he can definitely be a third pairing guy. In a pinch, play minutes, you don't really notice him unless he's laying a big hit or engaging or dropping the gloves with somebody that is going to beat him up, things like that. But the weird thing is, as a rookie, not this past year, but the year prior when he was on an AHL contract, he was listed at 6'2", 205 pounds in Leafs training camp. Last year, for some reason, that dropped all the way to 6 foot 185. So I don't know if that was Rifai getting stuck in an awkward spot between getting rounded up from 6'1" to 6'2" and then being rounded down, or what it is. But we usually see like a 1 inch difference sometimes, where sometimes they round up, sometimes they round down, depending on the measurement. That stuff happens. 2 inch difference, pretty rare to see. Like, that's pretty unusual. And then obviously the big drop in weight as well. So I don't know what happened there, but I think it's worth noting as well. So we'll see what he's listed at in camp this year and see if last year's rating was off for some reason, or if his first year's rating was off for some reason. So how did Rifai get on the Leafs radar in the first place? He played 3 seasons at Harvard, but essentially 2 seasons. He barely played as a freshman in 2018-19, just 6 games, and became more of a regular the following season as a sophomore, playing 30 games and putting up 8 points. Then his junior season was completely wiped out because Harvard, being an Ivy League school, did not play any sports that season. So his entire junior season was wiped out. Comes back as a senior, plays an even bigger role, puts up 13 points in 35 games. Again, offensive is never going to be a part of his game and wasn't at that age, but was a plus 23 rating in 35 games. The part that draws the Leafs' attention, of course, is going to be some of that two-way play. But one of the top players on that roster, both in 21-22, his final season in college with Harvard, and also in 2019-20, his first kind of foray into actually playing NCAA games, was with Nick Abruzzese on that Harvard Crimson squad. Abruzzese was obviously phenomenal in his collegiate career, particularly in that freshman campaign where he put up 44 points in 31 games. Then he returned for his junior season a couple years later after he missed that entire season in between and signed an NHL contract at the end of that. So Abruzzese only played 2 seasons of college. Rifai played 3 seasons, but essentially 2 seasons in addition to what the timeline was for Abruzzese. So I assume that's how Rifai got on the Leafs' radar. and probably something that the scouting staff, tons of times we see it where they'll see a player that they kind of like and bring into the organization as like a flyer after playing alongside a Leafs prospect or a prospect in the system, whatever team it is. So what comes next for Marshall Rifai? Obviously, it's a big training camp for him. It's his second year on an NHL contract. He impressed in his first training camp, got a lot of run with the Marlies that first season, got an NHL contract. Impressed again last training camp, ended up getting an NHL debut, really progressed over the course of the season from year one being kind of a more erratic, undisciplined, you see the raw tools, but need to kind of put the package together. And he started putting the package together last season. It's definitely not a perfect package, but there's legitimate NHL attributes there. And you can't say that about every depth defenseman, to say the least. So can he make an impact on next season's roster? It's going to be tough, just being straight up. I really like the player. I think he can play at the NHL level if he gets a chance. It's just going to be really tough to actually get those games. You look at the NHL roster, and you've got 6 legit options that are for sure on the roster. And Morgan Rielly, Chris Tanev, Jake McCabe, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Timothy Liljegren, and Simone Benoit. Those are all for sure 100% on the NHL roster. Connor Timmins is also there. I think it's 50-50 whether he's on the NHL roster or not. I don't know what's going to happen there. But then you've also got Yanni Hakanpää, who seems like he's still in the fold based off of what Brad Treliving said this week. You've also got Philippe Myers, who's coming off of an excellent season in the AHL, has NHL experience, right-hand shot, and is 6'6". You have Dakota Mermis, who played NHL games last year with the Minnesota Wild, has more experience, obviously, than somebody like Marshall Rifai. So you take all of those players. Let's say all of those players factor in. That is a lot of players to try and bounce over to even just get a sniff at the NHL roster. You're talking about 8 legitimate NHL options plus 2 depth options who have played NHL games over probably over Rifai on the depth chart, or at least guys that he's battling with for those minutes. And that's without even factoring in somebody like Mikko Kokkonen that impressed in last year's training camp. Cade Weber, who was with the Maple Leafs at the end of last season, and is a pretty big wild card. Topi Niemela there, who plays a different side in a different game. But like, there's a lot of guys in the mix here who are all battling for kind of the same role as kind of top call-up or bottom of the lineup guy. So as much as I'd like to see Rifai make the team at a camp, it's very unlikely that he actually will, unless there's some injuries for him to kind of benefit from. Like, look back to what happened in last year's camp. Like, Simone Benoit, for the great story that he ended up becoming, had a terrible preseason. He was injured. He played poorly, was waived, cleared waivers, and started the season with the Marlies. And that's for a guy that was on a one-way contract and played in the NHL the year prior, let alone a guy like Marshall Rifai, who was unproven at the NHL level and is on a two-way contract, even though he does require waivers. So for Rifai, it's pretty likely that he'll be with the Marlies once again. The top comparison that always comes to mind for me when talking about these AHL signed guys that start out and earn NHL contracts with the Leafs is, of course, Justin Holl, who, for all his flaws, is one of the big success stories in the Maple Leafs organization in terms of the development, where they picked him up after being a ECHLer out of college, even though he previously was a second-round pick. They bring him into the fold. He plays a legitimate role on one of the best AHL teams over 3 seasons, helps the team to a Calder Cup in 2017-18 as a legitimate top 4 defenseman on that team, playing important minutes, and eventually becomes a top 4 defenseman on the NHL team. And there were flashes where he was great. There were flashes where he wasn't so great. But overall, Justin Holl was a good player for the Maple Leafs on a pretty cheap contract and is a really impressive, great story in terms of his development. If Marshall Rifai can take a similar path to that, we would be looking at the 2018-2019 season for Justin Holl when he was 26 years old. He was on the NHL roster the entire season, but barely played. Only got into 11 games, had 1 assist in that time. It's, again, like I said, unlikely that Rifai gets that kind of on the NHL roster kind of play from the beginning of the season. It's very likely that he starts in the AHL at the very least and maybe is the top call-up option, something like that. So we're probably looking at 1 more year in the American Hockey League for Rifai, and then you kind of see what he is at the end of the season. Either he gets more NHL play, either he impresses again in the American Hockey League and kind of shows, hey, he's ready for the next step, or he kind of becomes a top 4 AHL defenseman and he moves on from the organization next year when he's a free agent. I think it's more likely that he's the former if he gets an opportunity than the latter. But again, we'll kind of see how things play out. Ultimately, I don't think he's going to really factor in to the NHL roster much just because of the bodies involved. But if he gets an opportunity, like I've said, I think he could show something. There is one intriguing possibility where Rifai ends up on a different team in the NHL. And that always comes back, of course, to the Pittsburgh Penguins, just because of the Kyle Dubas ties. The Athletic wrote a story, I believe it was Josh Cloak last year, kind of talking about Rifai and how he got to the Leafs organization. Actually, it might have been in his first year. I can't remember. It was either 22 or 23. But anyways, it was a story about Rifai and kind of how he got to the Leafs organization, what they like about him, that kind of stuff. And it talked about how Kyle Dubas was one of the people that pushed to sign Rifai to an AHL contract originally. Last year, I was worried that Dubas was going to pluck Bobby McMahon off waivers if he was waived. I think the Leafs kind of got lucky that McMahon got hurt in preseason and were able to sneak him through waivers as a result, because you look at what the Penguins needed last year and what Bobby McMahon became, and that would have been a great fit on the Pittsburgh Penguins is Bobby McMahon. And the Leafs got lucky there. They got lucky with Simone Benoit getting him through waivers. We'll see if they can get somebody like Marshall Rifai through waivers, who I think could be an NHL player. You look at the Penguins depth chart and you've got Sebastian Aho that's projected to play NHL games, Ryan Shea that's in the mix still, John Ludwig, who they claimed off waivers. And then there's obviously a couple guys from the Marlies days, and Matt Hollowell and Philip Kral being signed to NHL contracts this past summer for the Pittsburgh Penguins. They're at 48 NHL contracts. They've got 4 guys that are going to slide there, so they're technically at 52 contracts. 4 of those will slide, so they're basically at 48 contracts. It's very weird and messy how that works, but that's essentially how it works. Going to put them tight to the contract limit of 50 if they claimed a player off of waivers, so maybe that deters them. But if somebody were to claim Marshall Rifai on waivers, I could see the Pittsburgh Penguins being a team that could look at him. But there's a lot of NHL teams that have a lot of depth defensemen, so Rifai probably clears waivers, and I'm probably just overthinking things. So to conclude, again, just recapping, great skater, defensive acumen, great defensive stats last season at the AHL level, engages physically, isn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with somebody out of his weight class to stick up for a teammate. That's a lot of attributes to like for a player, and especially a depth defenseman. There are not many depth defensemen that have the skating that Marshall Rifai has. And at the very least, plug and play on a third pairing, playing 12, 13 minutes in a pinch, I think he can hang. And in those 2 NHL games he got last year, I think he showed perfectly fine that he's not going to be amazing, wow you, and he's also not going to hurt you too much. Again, the big thing to worry about for Rifai is the puck skill or offensive ability. It's just not really there, and the confidence on the puck isn't really there. And at 26 years old, turning 27 in March of the season, it's not going to come at this point in time. I think he's a player. I think he can play third pairing. I think he can be a guy that surprises if he gets an opportunity. Whether he gets that opportunity remains to be seen. Thanks for tuning in to this solo edition of Camp Countdown. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out any of the previous episodes. We've got a bunch already up, ready for you to check out if this is your first time tuning in. So thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week where we continue on with Camp Countdown as we're getting closer and closer to September. We'll see you then.